ค่ะขอต้อนรับทุกคนนะคะเข้าสู่เทศกาลบางกอกแหวกแนวค่ะเทศกาลแห่งความคิดครั้งแรกที่เกิดขึ้นในประเทศไทยนะคะดิฉันนิ่มกรกฎพลบรักษารับหน้าที่เป็นคนดูแลการเสวนาในครั้งนี้ค่ะ Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and join the Bangkok Age Festival. This is the Bangkok's first Ideas Festival. And today we will have so many talks from the authors from all around the world, from all over Asia. And today we will talk with one of the best authors that the book sells for 13 million. I would like you to get to know Sorry, I'm so excited because I really like her book so. We are honored today to have Jung Chang, whose book has sold more than 13 million copies worldwide. She will be with us today, together with Chris Lee, author of Drifting House and winner of the 2012 Story Prize Spotlight Award, who will be the moderator of this session. Now, please welcome Jung Lee and Chris Lee.
It looks like a very good crowd for the first inaugural festival. I want to just thank the festival organizers who have done an incredible job and managed to put together a program that was so varied and impressive, just interesting. I watched it in all the sessions myself. And thank you is particularly to Jung Chang for these incredible books that have just kept me riveted for the last weeks. It's been a long time since I've read books that have moved me so much. I don't know if you want to start with a few words or...
Well, we're very delighted to be here. Of course, wonderful to be here, and I just hope you enjoy this session.
We want to focus first on the book that many of you have already read, and if you haven't, I'm sure have heard about, as it was a legend and is still a legend, Wild Swans, and lead up to some general questions tying in Jung's latest book, which she will speak about in more detail, and then we'll open up with questions from the audience. So that's our hope. A lot to cram into an hour, but I think it's possible. Okay, so what I want to start with, I suppose, because both of these books, Wild Swans and Empress Dowager Cixi, cover in some ways a sense of belonging, I think, or question that this idea of both of the upheaval of Chinese modernization that led to your own forced, repeated relocation, or also the Empress's mission to rebuild the Summer Palace. And last night when we were talking, you mentioned how London was your home, and the way that you spoke about it made me wonder about the intersection of one's life and their material, and how you, in some ways, how do you see the eye in your work beyond the idea of memoir? What are the things that bring you to your subject matter?
Well, since you mentioned London, because London is home, and I love London, and it was because I was in London that I was able to write my books, to write Wild Swans, my first book, and my other books. One book that's not mentioned here, which is not here, which is actually the most important book I wrote. It was a biography of Mao, which I wrote with my husband, John Halliday, and we spent 12 years working on that book, whereas Wild Swans took me 2 years, and Empress Dowager 6 years. So that was a big hunk of our life, the biography of Mao. Well, I was born and grew up in China, and when I was a child, I loved writing. I would lie on the ground, staring at the cloud, and wondering what was happening behind the clouds. But to become a writer never entered my mind, because in those days, when I was growing up in China, in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, China was under the tyranny of Mao, and to be a writer was the most dangerous profession. And you know, even writing for oneself was dangerous. I'm sure you all know this now. And when the Cultural Revolution started in 1966, books were burned across China. And I wrote my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968. When I was lying in bed polishing my poem, I heard a door banging. Red Guards had come to raid our flat. I knew if they saw my poem, I would get into trouble. My family would get into trouble. So I had to quickly rush to the toilet to tear up the poem and flush it down the toilet. And that ended my, my first venture at writing. And then in 1976, Mao died, and things began to change. And in 1978, for the first time, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. I sat for a national exam, and I did reasonably well, so I became one of the first group of Chinese to ever get out of mainland China and study in the West. And then when I got my doctorate in linguistics from the University of York in 1982, because I was so lucky, I was the first person from communist China ever to get a doctorate from a British university. So London, you know, gave me all that, and I shouldn't be talking too long, but then they also enabled me to write my books.
No, I think we're here to listen to you, so this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for us all. As you said, London is what allowed you to write, is or enabled you, in a sense, to kind of lift, in some ways, a kind of necessary self-censorship for preservation of the self. And it made me think of the way you talk about doublethink. You mentioned the Orwellian term in Wild Swans. And what struck me was the parallels of what's also happening in North Korea today. And so I'm wondering about what were, if you don't mind, talking about some of the ways that double thinking, as a verb, affected you as a child, and how you transitioned in that period in England from lifting that idea of having to self-censor without even knowing what is self-censoring.
Well, I think at first, when you were a child, when I was a child, it wasn't quite so much self-censorship, because when we were growing up, you know, we were subjected to brainwashing. Mao was portrayed like our god. And when we were children, if we wanted to say what I say is absolutely true, we would say, I swear to Chairman Mao. And if the teachers wanted us to work hard, they would say, if you work hard, you'll be able to go to Beijing to see Chairman Mao. So the purpose of my life was couched in Mao's name. And so I wasn't aware of this sort of double thinking. But of course, you could also see people got into trouble because they didn't say the things that party wanted them to say. But all that was noises off when I was growing up in China. In fact, my parents were communist officials, so I grew up in this very privileged environment of the communist elite. We lived in this armed compound with chauffeurs and cooks and gardeners. I grew up so much taking hierarchy and privilege for granted. When I first arrived in England, my first impression was England was wonderfully classless. And of course, my views have been modified over the years. And then I learned double thinking. I guess that moment I destroyed my first poem was a moment that I realized, I couldn't think these thoughts. I couldn't write these words. But, the desire to write never left me. In the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and as a barefoot doctor. A barefoot doctor was a doctor without any training, because Mao said, the more books you read, the more stupid you become. And so that was the guideline for health and education. And so I started to treat people, stick needles into people for acupuncture without any training. And of course the peasants all steered clear of me sensibly. But there were also, we were all young in those days. I was 16, and there were boys who were also sent down from the cities in other villages. Some were keen on me, and they would walk for hours to have an acupuncture session. So that's how I practiced being a barefoot doctor. And then I became a steel worker and an electrician. And when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I was always writing in my head with an invisible pen. It's just I couldn't put pen to paper. And then I arrived in London.
Well, I think it's a well-known story for most of us, the phenomenal success of Wild Swans, well-deserved success. But what comes with that, I imagine, is the kind of burden that Harper Lee of To Kill a Mockingbird felt as well. The burden of writing again after a book brings you that much love and attention from readers. And yet you've managed many decades earlier than Harper Lee did to continue writing. And I was wondering what that process was like to overcome the sudden spotlight and to be able to move on with your next projects.
Okay, I think my situation is different from, of course, Harper Lee. But one difference is how I came to write. When I first arrived in London, when I could write, it was at that moment I lost the desire to write, because I had come into a completely different world. It was like landing on Mars. Everything was different. So I just wanted to spend every minute soaking up the new world. And to write for me would be to look back and to look inward into a past which I wanted to forget all about. Just a couple of stories when I first arrived in London. And of course, we were under strict control. There were 14 of us. We had to move in a group. We couldn't go out on our own. And we were all wearing the Mao suit. And we were told not to do this and that and the other. And one thing we were particularly told not to do was to go into an English pub, because the Chinese translation for pub, 酒吧, in those years suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. So we were told never to go into a pub. But of course I was torn with curiosity. And I knew there was a pub across the road from the college. And one day I sneaked out of the college. I darted across the road. I threw the door of the pub open. Of course, I saw nothing of the kind. Only some men sitting there drinking beer. I was rather disappointed, of course. So you imagine life was absolutely riveting. So I didn't want to write about the past. And the past was painful because, in the Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years, from 1966 to 1976, and my family suffered great tragedies. My father spoke up, protested the violence and atrocities, and he was arrested, tortured, driven insane. he was exiled to a camp and died very tragically, prematurely. My mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father. She refused, although she had a lot of bitterness against my father, but she stood by him. So as a result, my mother was put through over 100 of those ghastly denunciation meetings. Basically the victims were stood on the stage, their arms were ferociously twisted to the back, and their heads were pushed down, and they were kicked and beaten, and my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. Anyway, so my mother survived. She was exiled to a camp, she survived. And my beloved grandmother, who really brought us up, she also died in the Cultural Revolution. So these things I just didn't want to forget all about. In fact, when I was in London, when I was beginning to sneak out and to lead a secret life, I was always telling people I was from South Korea. Because if I said I was from China, China was like Mars, and everybody wanted to know what's happening. A bit like everyone wants to know what's happening in North Korea. I think the two countries were very well, had a lot of similarities, and so people didn't ask. Oh. But in 1988. 10 years after I came to Britain, my mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time in our lives, she told me the stories of her life and stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And once my mother started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. When I was listening to my mother, I kept saying to myself, I've got to write all this down. And then I also realized how much I wanted to be a writer, and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. And it was at that moment I suddenly realized, the love of my life was to write. And that's how I started writing Wild Swans. So when the book finished, I actually, funny enough, for a brief moment, I was worried, whether the readers, how the reviews would be, the readers' reaction would be, the book would sell. But my mother put me out of, my mother just relieved me of all this anxiety. And she said, the book might not do well, people might not pay attention to it, but I was not worried, because she could feel that writing the book had brought us closer, and I had made her a happy woman, because she started telling me the stories. In fact, the first story was her bitterness against my father. All these things she bottled up in her for decades, and now she was able to tell me, and at the end of it, she said, actually your father was not was not a horrible man. I understand he loved me, and so on. So my mother said she'd become a happy woman. And with my mother's encouragement, I stopped thinking about how the book would be received. And so I was spared the anxiety of most writers would have when your first book was about to be published. And it so happened that the book is a success. My mother, who only wanted the understanding from her daughter to start with, now has understanding from readers, tens of millions of readers all over the world. And I have become a writer. So I think I fulfilled my dream. I've become a writer. It never did occur to me that I would stop writing and just have this success. And now that I've become a writer, all I wanted to write more.
In your father, the portrayal of your father in a book that's supposedly primarily about the woman of these 3 generations of your woman in your family, was also a remarkable man, it seems, in so many ways, with the kind of strain and the pressure of history, in a sense, pressing against the entire family, and yet having that kind of, I suppose, a moral stance that is sadly lacking in the world, in much of the world today. We rarely see that kind of a strength anymore, and it seems like both your mother and your father were quite remarkable characters.
Yes, my father, I love my father very much, of course. His death and the death of my grandmother are the most painful spots in my heart. But it's also true that my mother first told me the stories, was a story against my father. She said that they were just married, she was 18, and she was new to the revolution, and my father was a communist officer. And they were marching from northeast China to Sichuan, my father's home place. The journey was over 1,000 miles long. And my father was entitled to a jeep or horse, whichever was available. And because my mother was new to the revolution, so she had to walk. And she wanted my father to give her a lift. And my father wouldn't. And wouldn't even carry her bedroll. And so my mother suffered a miscarriage and lost her first child. And of course, all these were communist rules. And my father said, the communists had vowed to get rid of nepotism. And then when I was about to be born, doctors said that I was too big in my mother's womb. And my mother, it could be dangerous. And the doctors said my mother should be transferred to another hospital where they had better doctors and better facilities. And my father was the governor of the region. He vetoed it. He said his wife had to be treated like everybody else. So my mother was absolutely furious, and she said, he doesn't love me, he's all that. But yes, my father was he was incorruptible to a fault, almost. And he was always sticking to the rules. But later on, it also occurred to me that somehow these communist rules against the corruption always applied to the family. The officials themselves would be entitled to all sorts of privileges. It's their families, their wives, their children, who they must sacrifice to demonstrate their incorruptibility. So it's
Complicated.
quite complicated. Yeah.
And with since we mentioned the woman, of course, that the book focuses on, Wild Swans focuses on, and we pass through so much time through these, the woman, the 3 women in the book, including you, of course. Did you start out writing Wild Swans, as well as, of course, Empress Dowager Cixi and a strong woman character? Did you start out with the intention to write about lives of strong, complex women, or was this, or did you see a general subject matter that with the preoccupation that grew more prominent as you were researching and as you were writing?
Well, Wild Swans, I guess, was a book I had been writing for years. When I was, as I said earlier, spreading manure in the paddy fields or checking electricity supplies. I was always writing about these experiences in my head. So when I sat down to write it, I first transcribed my mother's tape recordings, and then I did more research. And when I actually sat down to write, it was just like the thoughts just rushed out. There was no kind of planning. I didn't think this was going to be about women or whatever. All I think I was aware was that I want to write about my personal story, but I wanted the background of China, the history of China, the society to be in the background. And I wanted our personal stories to reflect China in the 20th century.
And, this is going to be the last question because I know we want to talk, well, you have much to share about your latest book. So just kind of leading into that, I think both books in different ways revealed a history that was not known to many people at the time, or a history that is seen very differently. And I wondered, in the process of writing 3 books that are intensively rigorous in terms of research and rethinking about the point of view you approach history, did your thoughts about history, both the writing of history and the making of history, change in the process of writing these 3 epic narratives?
Yes. I mean, I think with Wild Swans, of course, I learned a lot of things. For example, I learned about, I learned about foot binding. I mean, somehow we all heard about foot binding. I grew up with my grandmother having bound feet. And I saw her bound feet because every time after, when we went out, and when she came back, she would be in intense agony. She would soak her feet in a bowl of hot water. She would cut the dead skin, and she would say, people say you would you would get used to the pain, but you would never. Now, I just wanted to show you my grandmother's shoe. You see, she was my size, but her feet were like this, because foot binding was not just to put a piece of cloth around the feet. Only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone to broken the bones. And the binding was just there to stop the broken bones from recovering. And I remember my mother and I were walking in Hyde Park in London, and she would point at this pile of stones in the park and said those were the stones. Stones were like this, which they were put on baby girls' feet to stop the baby girls trying to crawl away and to untie their binding. So with my mother telling me the stories, I mean, I then started to understand what, agony my grandmother had been through all her life. And this is also how I eventually wrote Empress Dowager Cixi, the Concubine who launched modern China. Because during my research, I realized it wasn't the communists who got rid of foot binding, as we were told in our education or brainwashing. It was the Empress Dowager who first banned foot binding. And I then got very surprised because the Empress Dowager's impression and reputation was that she was a vicious woman. She was a die-hard conservative. She was cruel, and etc. And then why did she ban foot binding? And what else did she do? She banned foot binding at the beginning of the 20th century. And then that first got me interested in her. And of course, I didn't do anything at the time when I was writing Wild Swans 20 years ago. And then I started to write the biography of Mao with my husband. And then we discovered that when Mao was born in 1893, we discovered that when he was growing up under the Empress Dowager And in the period just after her death, Mao was living an extraordinary free life with boundless opportunities. You know, he was a peasant lad, but he could go to a modern college with scholarship. He could go abroad if he wanted to, and it so happened he didn't want to. And he could travel the country with girlfriends and check into hotels. It was immense sexual freedom. And also he could write for an incredibly free press on whatever subject he was interested in. And all these freedom and opportunities I couldn't dream of when I was growing up under Mao. And so that's, again, I didn't do anything when we were researching Mao. So after Mao was finished, I started writing The Empress Dowager. By the way, I mean, Jung, of course, also helped me with writing Wild Swans. Because, you know, when I learned English, I learned English under Mao. And China was completely closed to the outside world. There were no foreigners, and even our teachers had never seen foreigners themselves. So our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts. I remember the lesson greetings. In those days in China, when we bumped into each other, we said, 吃饭了吗？上哪儿去? Which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned. When I first arrived in London, I used to go around and ask people where they were going and whether they had eaten. So obviously, without Jung's help, Wild Swans could not have taken off. And when we then started to write the biography of Mao, we divided our research by language. Because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And Jung, who's half English, half Irish, unfortunately speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he knows Russian. And he spent years working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove. And we caught this window of opening in the 1990s when we were researching Mao, because Yeltsin opened the Russian archives, and in China, you know, people who knew Mao were still alive and talked. So, we won't go into that, but we had a riveting time.
This is a good time to really talk more in detail about your latest book, Empress Dowager Cixi. Would you like to take it?
I just got this powerful.
Would it be easier to have the mic or?
Okay. Now, Empress Dowager Cixi, she was born in 1835. When she was, this was Beijing at her time, and when she was 16 years old, she went through one of those periodic nationwide selections for imperial consorts. You know, Chinese emperors were allowed one empress and as many concubines as he liked. So like hundreds of girls from all over China, and Cixi was paraded in front of the emperor. She caught the eye of the emperor, and she was selected as one of his numerous concubines. She was playing chess in the palace with a eunuch. And this is her husband, Emperor Xianfeng. In 1860, Emperor Xianfeng was forced to flee Beijing. And the reason was that the British invaded, the British and the French invaded. The British wanted more trade with China, but Emperor Xianfeng, like his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, refused to open the door of China. And so the British invaded. And you know this man, Lord Elgin, the son of the Elgin marble repute or disrepute, and then burned down the old summer palace. And Emperor Xianfeng was heartbroken, so he didn't want to return to Beijing, and he died in self-imposed exile in the northern wilderness beyond the Great Wall of China. And he had only one son. That son succeeded the throne, and that son happened to be by Cixi, who was a lowly concubine. Of course, this is not their son. This was actually one of the ancestors of the Pekingese dog. Because the Empress Dowager, like the previous Chinese empress, had been breeding the Pekingese in the court. And when Lord Elgin's troops got into the old summer palace, they found the corpse of an elderly imperial concubine who hadn't managed to flee with the court. And she died of fright. And around her corpse were 5 Pekingese dogs. So the British brought them back to Britain and started to breed them. And that's how we had Pekingese. And this particular one was presented to Queen Victoria, and it was named Luti. And Queen Victoria had this picture painted. And this boy in blue was Cixi's son. And he was 5 years old, and his father, on his dying bed, appointed 8 imperial, princes and big officials to be his joint regents. But at this point, in 1861, Cixi, at the age of 25, launched a palace coup and got rid of those 8 regents, together with the Empress. These 2 women, I'm afraid I was surprised, because the harem, to me, was a place where women were doing backbiting, they were stabbing each other for the emperor's favor. But far from it, these 2 women were best friends, and they were comrades in this coup together. And they succeeded. And of the 8 regents, they had 3 killed, 1 decapitated, 2 were each sent a long white silk scarf to hang themselves with, which was considered an imperial favor. It's called a cibo, it's in the Chinese language. But the coup, otherwise the coup was completely bloodless, and it was very successful and popular. And this was because the 2 women asked a very simple question. Why must we keep the door of China closed and have all these wars, have our palaces burned? Why can't we do business with the West and benefit China itself? And this simple thought changed China, and China began its modernization from 1861, from their coup, time of their coup. And this is Cixi being carried to the morning audience by the eunuchs. And the 2 women ruled in a very particular way. They were not allowed to be face-to-face with men by tradition. So they had to see the officials who would prostrate themselves in front of the throne. The 2 women had to sit not on the throne, but behind the throne and behind the curtains of the throne. And the 5-year-old son would occasionally be carried out and put on the throne. And this is the grand front part of the Forbidden City. Some of you might have seen it. And Cixi, even though he was the de facto supreme ruler of China for nearly half a century, on and off, but mainly on, she never set foot on the front part because it was forbidden to women. Women were confined to the harem, and Cixi hated it. She said it's all walls and gates. But it was from this very confined world they changed the empire. Cixi sent people abroad and invited foreigners in China. And this man is an Ulsterman from Ireland, Robert Hart. And Cixi employed him to run Chinese customs. And he did great service to Chinese economy, contributing as much as 1/3 of China's national income. And this man standing in the middle is called Anson Burlingame. He was President Lincoln's first ambassador to China after Cixi opened the door. And when his term ended, Cixi made him China's first ambassador to the West. So he led this delegation with one British secretary, one French secretary, and they traveled for nearly 3 years around the Western world and to say there is a new China now who wants to do business with the West. Now, this is one of the very first group of Chinese being sent abroad in the 1870s. These boys went to America to receive comprehensive education. And when they went to China, they all became pillars of of modern China. Now, everything we have here, electricity, the railway, telephone, films, and modern army, modern navy, modern mining, the first national flag, the entirely new educational system, a legal system based on Western model, and women's liberation. All these things had been brought into China by the Empress Dowager Cixi. And she, as I mentioned, she was the person who banned foot binding. She released women from their homes and encouraged them to have education, to go abroad. And yet, even today, her reputation is a completely different one. This is part of the reason my book is banned in China, of course. All my books banned. Okay. All right, okay, now, but Cixi had a problem. Her reforms were on the go, stop way. And this was because, as a woman, she couldn't be a legitimate ruler. She had to rule when the emperor was a child. And she could rule from behind the curtain, behind the throne. So her son was 5, so she ruled for more than a decade. And then the son was 16 years old. He was an adult. He took over. But the 16-year-old had no interest in reforms. He had no interest in running the empire. He's the Emperor Tongzhi. And like a 16-year-old, he loved fun, he loved sex. He particularly loved having sex, sneaking out of the Forbidden City to have sex with male as well as female prostitutes. But he died after being the emperor for over a year. And people say he was killed, murdered by Cixi, but he wasn't. He died of smallpox. But Cixi did grab this opportunity to adopt a 3-year-old from her sister. And this is Emperor Guangxu. And of course, Cixi's goal was to rule as long as possible with this 3-year-old. So this is Emperor Guangxu. But Emperor Guangxu also grew up, and he grew up not even wanting to have fun. He was full of phobia, and he was terrified of thunders. So whenever there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs in the palace would gather and shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunders. And he was contented to stay in the Forbidden City and working on his classics. And his classics, because Cixi was not a good mother, and he didn't ill-treat him, but she adopted him for political reasons, not really out of loving this child. So this young Emperor Guangxu then had this father figure who was a renowned classics tutor. So these two were running the country. They shelved all Cixi's reforms, railways, and all these were stopped. Now Japan grabbed this opportunity and attacked China in 1894. And on Japan's side, there were these world-class statesmen, and on the side of China, there was this 20-something-year-old who rarely stepped out of the gates of the Forbidden City with his classics tutor, his main advisor, and the tutor also hated foreigners. And the outcome is obvious. China suffered a spectacular defeat. So Westerners, Europeans, which had the countries which had so far some respect for China because of its size, and now realized this was a paper tiger full of hot air. And so they all came to China to ask a bit of Chinese land. The Germans first came and asked for the area near Qingdao in Shandong province. I don't know whether you know about the Qingdao beer, and that's because they were initially made by the Germans. And the British asked for something, the French, the Russians, and so on. These things were all strategic spots on China's coast. And these foreign occupations gave rise to some xenophobia. And these were boxers. I don't know, some of you might have heard of this in 1900. The boxers, the xenophobic peasants. So Western powers threatened invasion, and Cixi at this point made a fatal mistake. She thought she had no army, no navy, they were destroyed by the Japanese, and what would she do facing these foreign invasions of 8 powerful countries? And so she thought maybe these boxers who hated foreigners could be brave soldiers. But as you can see, the boxers were armed with sticks and knives. They were no match for the allied force of 8 powers. So Cixi was driven out of the Forbidden City. This was the allied army, European countries, armies entering Forbidden City. But during her exile, Cixi regretted. She issued edicts of self-reproach. She made peace with the West. The West also reflected, there was some searching on both sides, and they made up. So Cixi returned to the Forbidden City. This is a rare photograph of her waving at a foreign photographer on the city wall. And this was a historical wave because Chinese monarchs were never to be seen. And when they went out, huge screens would be erected to shield them from the public eye. But Cixi learned from her envoys abroad that Western monarchs wave at their subjects. So she did her first wave. She also had her first photographs taken in 1903. And when the photographer saw the prints, he was worried because the Empress Dowager looked her age, which was nearly 70. And so the photographer touched up the photographs. The bags were erased, wrinkles disappeared, and Cixi looked like a woman in her prime. And when Cixi saw the pictures, she was thrilled. She had them blown up to giant sizes and hung them all over the Forbidden City. And she selected some and gave them to Western heads of state. And this one was given to the American president, and it's hung in Washington. Okay, now a lot of interesting things about her, but there was a tragic story, which was in her late 20s, at the beginning of her reform. So she fell in love with a eunuch. And in the palace, in her world, there was, the men were only the emperor and the eunuchs. And as you can see, these eunuchs were, good-looking young men. And so she fell in love with one of them. And to please him, she sent him out of the Forbidden City. But the eunuchs were imprisoned in the Forbidden City. So she sent them out. She sent him even down this great canal which linked North China to the south, so he could celebrate his birthday under a big moon with music and so on. And all the conservatives were furious, of course, so they seized the eunuch and had him executed together with his entourage. And they exposed his body for 3 days and 3 nights, so the public could see he had no male organs. And so she suffered a nervous breakdown, a really bad nervous breakdown. And from then on, there was no sign of another sort of romantic liaison. The cost was too high. Okay, the last story, this is his funeral. Now, the day before she died, so she poisoned the emperor, her nephew, Emperor Guangxu. And as far as she was concerned, if she had died and the emperor was still alive, China would land on the lap of Japan, because the Japanese ambition on China did not just start from the Second World War. It had started from the end of the 19th century. And the emperor had wanted to go along with Japan, very much like the last emperor in the film, The Japanese Puppet, many years later. And so she had him poisoned. And the next day, she died in 1908. Thank you.
I think we have about 10 minutes for some questions. Let's see, can we start here? Yes. And do we have a mic?
Hi, Victor Mallet. I was there in Hong Kong when you launched the Mao book, and I'm curious to know, about the reaction to the book, because a lot of people who criticised it said you were so negative about Mao, you portrayed him as a 100% monster, and that wasn't the way he was. And I presume there was also a lot of criticism from the Chinese side about the way he was shown to be in his early years pretty much a plaything of the Soviet Communist Party. But I just wonder, how that debate has moved on. How have you kind of responded to those criticisms? Are people still saying that actually Mao was not such a bad guy? And I don't mean the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party necessarily, but also other scholars and so on. I just want to say I really enjoyed the book, and I was convinced by it, but obviously some people sort of felt that you were too nasty to Mao.
Well, I think Mao really deserves the nastiest, whatever, something done to him. The thing is, I'm very glad to say that 10 years on, that's 10 years now, 10 years on, and with various other books being published, and more is known about Mao, I think very few people would now stand up and defend Mao in the way that they did when our book came out in 2005. And of course, the Chinese government is promoting Mao at the moment, which is just simply tragic, which is whatever thing I can think of. Anyway, so we discount them, but outside China, I think the mainstream has rejected Mao. I think, if I may say, I think has largely accepted our view that Mao belongs to the league of Hitler and Stalin, and that's that. And by the way, I mean, some of these attackers have set up a website and to try to get people to find faults, to pick faults with our book. But I'm very glad to say, I don't think there is a single factual fault they have picked. I mean, somebody knows otherwise, please enlighten me. But I'm so pleased because we were very careful for these 12 years. We know we were going to be attacked. We were so careful about everything. And I don't think anyone can challenge any of our facts about Mao.
Another question, I saw a few hands in the front and back before. Let's see, I think there's someone over there. And also, if there's someone who has a question in Thai, we have someone here to interpret for you. So please don't be shy about it.
As an author who's criticizing the communist regime, have you ever felt that your life has been in danger, particularly as a few publishers have now mysteriously disappeared?
Yes. Well, I mean, ever since we were researching the book, which was in the 1990s, we, meaning me and my husband, as we discovered what explosive materials we have discovered, we knew we were going to be in trouble. Exactly what sort of trouble, we had no idea. But we knew and we were prepared. We were prepared psychologically. We didn't have bodyguards. We couldn't afford. But we were prepared, and we just regarded this as a professional hazard. And if that's what we have decided to do, to be a writer, to write about history, as we all know, for a totalitarian or whatever, for a tyranny, for a dictatorship, history is often the most dangerous. And so we just, but I mean, so far so good.
Anyone in the back that we're missing at all? No? Anyone have another question? Maybe consider, yes.
So you mentioned that the research, the sources were in the Russian archives, and I'm just curious to know, so how did they happen to, how did they happen to have the archives of the history?
Russia. Well, that's very, very interesting. You know, most of the Chinese archives to do with the Chinese Communist Party in China actually came from Russia. And in those days, Chinese Communist Party was a branch of the Communist International, under Stalin. I mean, they constantly wrote reports to Moscow, and everything they did internally, there is a duplicate to Moscow. And the archives in the Chinese hands were destroyed in the war, whatever, or just simply burned by Mao, who didn't believe in keeping record. Whereas Moscow believed very much, and they were in Moscow, so they were preserved, and my husband was able to find it. I'm very glad to say that after our book was published, actually, I think Beijing sent a sizable delegation to Moscow and photocopied all the documents we could. And yeah, so it's a treasure trove, really.
Okay, over there.
Yes, I read both the books, and I would like to ask, would you like to write also about, let's say, the bad things that Europeans have done to Asia, not only to China? Thailand, we are very lucky we can escape the colonial time, and let's say books like The Rape of Nanking or sort of a portray about things that we should not repeat. And can I have another question about Buddhism? Do you think that, let's say, China will go back to Buddhism? Will Buddhism will be an important element for the development of China in the future?
Well, about the things bad things Europeans did to China, I think in my Empress Dowager's book, there are quite a few. I mean, as I mentioned just now, the burning down of the Summer Palace. Although Lord Elgin intended it to be a lesson to the Chinese emperor for killing, in ghastly ways, scores of not just British soldiers, but Indian soldiers and so on, which went as a peace envoy, but were killed, were captured and killed. But still, I mean, it's not an excuse. It's not a reason, whatever, to burn down this giant summer palace, in my view. I mean, in many other people's views. Because if we have been to Beijing, if you have seen the current summer palace built by the Empress Dowager, in fact, her life's ambition was to rebuild that gorgeous old summer palace that was burned down. And the current summer palace was just an insignificant part of this gigantic compound. So, things like that. It wasn't, my book is not a race war, it's not one thing against another, but I try to be fair and just. I mean, this is, by the way, also, I think we try to be fair and just to Mao. And some people say that I wrote this Mao book because of my revenge. I was carrying out revenge on behalf of my father or my grandfather. But I would say that actually this was not in my thought. I'm not a vengeful person. I think revenge would hurt me more than probably Mao. But I also think that there is nothing wrong if people wanted to get even with Mao. But I mean, that's not my, it's not my, I don't write books. I write books for pleasure. I don't write books to vent anger.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Jung Chang. Thank you. We still have the big sign outside after this one. You have time and you can go and support, or if you're interested, you can have some talk afterward, because the next one that will happen, the next talk will be